Thank you all for coming. Some of you know me, some of you don't. I'm Ed Friedman. I chair Friends of Mary Bay. I'd like to introduce, we have a new staff person, executive director, Erin Macro right back here, red hair. Her first speaker series, and so thank you all for coming. I'll say a little bit about what we do, and then I'll introduce our speaker. And also, I'll start with, got the sign-in sheet going around. The series costs us well over $1,000 to put on each year, between printing, taking our speakers out to meals, so forth like that. And so Patagonia sponsors the series for us. They donate some product to use as incentive for a door prize. Again, for those of you that don't know, we are a very unique organization in that we look at the Bay and this area and the Gulf of Maine in a holistic way. So our speaker, Gay Grant here, she's an author for many years. She's written a couple of books, some of which are over on the table here, and she's actually graciously offered to split proceeds of book sales with us tonight. So I urge you to buy more than I would ordinarily to buy a book from Gay tonight. And Ron was kind enough to drive her down tonight and do the sound check with her. So one of the books along the Kennebec, the Herman Bryant collection, she'll talk about both of these, I guess, and then another friend of hers from England who evacuated from the urban area during World War II to get away from the bombing, and it's that story there. Gay owns The Right Way. She's a grant writer as well as being an author, and you've been doing that about 25 years, 30 years or so, so most of it for nonprofits. And as you could tell from the way she worked the room, I've never had a speaker do this before. She served in the legislature for a while, from 2012 to 2018. And she's born and bred in Gardner, and South Gardner, and she and Ron met in high school, and they've been married a long time, and still here doing their thing. So I'll leave it at that. You're not doing the technical stuff that I had in my little notes there with the ML, who was it?
No, Melmac.
Yeah.
That's old news. Yeah.
But she's
that's
acquired,
an old website. That's the problem with my
she's acquired millions of dollars in grants for various nonprofits in the area, and I'm sure everyone really appreciates that. Thank you. So
thank you.
Have at it.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ed, and thank all of you for coming out this evening, for giving me this opportunity to share with you what I know, and maybe even some of what I don't know about one of my favorite subjects, Edwin, Arlington Robinson. And the photos that I'm going to use tonight are a combination of photos that I took when I was on one of the Gardner historical walking tours, which I brought a brochure for you tonight, and I'll give to you at the end. And I encourage you to come to Gardner because it's a wonderful place. Most of you have already been there. And you can see for yourself the places that were important to Robinson and soak in that atmosphere. It's a wonderful walk, and you really, especially this time of year. So if any of you decide to come, I've left my card on the table. And if we can work out logistics, I'd be happy to be your tour guide. But you can do it totally on your own, at your speed, with this wonderful brochure that you can get copies of at the Gardner Public Library. And they gave these to me to give out to you tonight. The other photos that I'm going to use tonight are actually from the book that I did that Ed referred to earlier, called Along the Kennebec. And Along the Kennebec has photographs by a turn-of-the-century photographer named Herman Bryant. Herman was an ordinary mill worker, but his passion for photography and what he's left behind, I think, really enhance the Robinson poetry and the Robinson story, because they in fact lived in Gardner at roughly the same time. So the things that Robinson talked about in his poetry, the area, the environment that he absorbed, that informed his poetry, is really beautifully, I think, reflected in Bryant's photos. It's hard to see here. I think I'm going to do this. Yeah, thank you. So This is the Robinson House in Gardner on Lincoln Avenue, and this is a photo. There are some other photos in the talk tonight that are from the Gardner Public Library archives, from family archives from the Robinson family, and so I use those with their blessing tonight. The first slide really shows you what the house looked like at the time of Robinson's living in the house. And this is a photo that I did of the house when I was on the walking tour one beautiful fall day, getting ready for this presentation. You can see it hasn't changed that much. But I'd like to go back here, because when I did the walking tour, and I encourage this, if you're into poetry, if you're into history, there's nothing like absorbing a place, absorbing an environment to really enrich your understanding of a subject. As I walked up Danforth Street, this house is on the corner of Lincoln and Danforth, from the Robinson house to the Robinson Palmer family plot in Oak Grove Cemetery, I think about how it must have been that bleak November day in 1896. I could almost hear the local minister's voice droning the prayers of the dead from a safe distance, his mouth covered in a handkerchief. Diphtheria had claimed another victim in town, and the minister would do several such calls that day. 3 young men lifted their mother's body from the bed and laid her in her coffin. They carried her in a hired wagon, those 295 steps up Danforth Street. In a hired wagon, as I said. Beside their father, they interred her. Their father, Edwin, had only been deceased for 4 years. Mary Palmer Robinson's 3 children served as her only undertakers and mourners. Only days after the Robinson sons had buried their mother, the house was still under plague quarantine when a box of books was dropped on the front porch. In the box were copies of a slim blue paper-covered volume entitled The Torrent and the Night Before. Rejected by every publisher Robinson had sent it to, he had published it with the help of friends, $52 for 312 copies. He wanted to surprise his mother with the books for Christmas. This is the cemetery, and I know that it's 294 steps because I counted it from the Robinson stone, and this is looking back down out of the cemetery, and as you go here, down Danforth Street, you're just a few steps from the Robinson house. So if you're on the tour, I'm just pointing out some of those things so that you'll remember. Here's the book that was reissued in 1996 on the centenary of that publishing by the Gardner Library Association and Tilbury House Publishers. We hosted a week-long poetry and historical symposium in Gardner for that event. The man who would one day rank among America's greatest poets, winning 3 Pulitzer Prizes, among other laurels, began with little promise and a tragic family history. Yet these 28 years of formation in the small city of Gardner along the Kennebec River provided material for poetry that is still considered among the best in the English language. Gardner was a place Robinson had dreamt of escaping for most of his life. But it was the right connections here in the unprepossessing town of industry that were to be critical to his eventual success. Edwin Arlington Robinson was born December 22, 1869, in Head Tide, Maine, near the town of Alna. His father, Edward, was 50, and his mother, Mary Palmer Robinson, 35. They had 2 sons, and Mary had wanted a girl. It was a difficult birth, and Mary suffered a long postpartum depression. For the first 6 months of his life, the future poet didn't even have a name. Mary recuperated at a summer boarding house at the coast. The other ladies there were shocked that the baby had no name. One suggested that they all write names and place them in a hat for Mary to draw. Edwin was drawn. And the lady who had put the idea forward was from Arlington, Massachusetts. Thus, Edwin Arlington Robinson was named. Robinson never liked his name and was called Wynne by his family, but preferred EA or EAR as an adult. Out of respect, I will always refer to him as EAR. Names were very important to Robinson, and the names he chose for the characters in his poetry reflect the care he took with what those names would sound like and how they would reflect in his poetry. And he disliked his name also because his father's name was Edward, And as I just stumbled over it, even though I studied this for so long, people were always confusing it. And in fact, the headlines for the story in the Gardner paper, when he won his first Pulitzer, credited it to Edward Arlington Robinson. And even his obituary in the local paper had it Edward. So it's easy to stumble, and he never, ever liked the name. In about the same decade that the Robinson family arrived in Gardner, another man came to the city looking for work in its mills. Herman Bryant was born in 1858 in Hartland, Vermont, and came to Gardner to marry his sweetheart and build their life together. Here we see Bryant some years later when he had taken up the newly popular art of photography, reading about the art in this self-portrait. Yeah. And here is the Lawrence Lumber Mill in South Gardner, just down the street from where Ron and I live now, where Bryant found employment. Robinson and Bryant, one famous and the other obscure, lived parallel lives, even down to summering on the same islands in Booth Bay Harbor. Both focused their art on ordinary people, the industries and area around the river valley. Given the social structure of the time, they were not likely to have met, but Bryant, no doubt, followed the career of Gardner's most famous son as he gained national recognition. Here we see Herman, his wife Viola, and her brother Arnaldo English, also a photographer, on the hill they loved to take pictures from overlooking the Kennebec River near the Bryant home. This is a slide of the Bryants and their neighbors in a boat called the Minnie and the Mary that's on the cover of my book. And it was from this boat that they took many, many trips down the Kennebec River, down here, through the Mary Meeting Bay, and to the islands. If you weren't fortunate enough to have your own boat, you could take the Islander from Gardner, from the wharf at 7 a.m. and get to Booth Bay for lunch, with the short pickup stop at Main Street in South Gardner. I think it also stopped in Richmond and other places along the way at these small places, but this is at the South Gardner Wharf. I've included this photo of the Bryants and friends at Capitol Island because the Robinson family spent almost every summer on the same island. This and Squirrel Island were popular with Gardner folks, if Bryant's photographs are any indication. I also thought it would be fun to throw in Mary Meeting Casino, taken September 13th, 1899, showing Bryant's wife, Viola, and daughter Minnie, along with friends. I thought you'd enjoy that. The Robinsons moved to Gardner in 1870. EAR grew up in a house full of Yankee perfectionists with ambitions of wealth. He was always painfully conscious of his failure to succeed in the vocational and material sense. His poetry aspirations were kept secret from his father, who thought him lazy. Although his mother recognized her youngest son's sensitivity, she seemed unable to understand him. Gardner, as you can see from this photograph, Gardner in the years of Robinson's childhood and youth was a bustling town full of industry, with businesses booming along the river's banks, in its mills, factories, and shops. As you can see from these Bryant photos, the ice industry was in its heyday, and surrounding farms used the port of Gardner to ship their produce all over. Money was the focus, and rich natural resources were here to be exploited. Gardner's location at the head of the river's tide and its connection to Cobbessy Stream's several dams were major advantages to that end. And I include these, again, because this is all part of the environment and the milieu in which Robinson grew up and really informed so much of his poetry. This is the Richards Sulfite Pulp Paper Mill in South Gardner, as taken from the opposite side of Pittston. These, as you can see, Bryant sometimes actually told me what his pictures were. I spent several years cataloging 800 pieces of artifacts from his collection, and I loved it when he told me straight out what they were. This is looking down the Kennebec, and as you can see, we have steamers, we have tugboats towing three-masted schooner up to the ice houses to take ice away. We have all those logs coming down the river. The log booms can be seen. You can still, of course, you guys know this well. You can see the rotting remains of them. And in fact, there was so much of the lumber coming down that helped pollute the river. This is behind the Lawrence Lumber Mill. This is a 40-foot high pile of logs coming up out of the river. And you can see how small the men are in comparison to this pile. These are a group of men who are piling logs onto a flat-bottom scow, which I think is one that was built in South Gardner. I can't be sure. And this is a four-masted schooner at the Weeks Ice House, getting ready to load all those chunks, giant chunks of white gold into the hold of the ship, packed in sawdust and sent to ports all over the world. These are the men and the teams who actually did that work. And you can see the elevators, the steam-powered elevators, taking the huge chunks of ice up into the ice houses. Robinson was an avid skater, and everybody in the valley always waited for when the river froze over. It was a big deal. And when it was deep enough to cut, deep enough to skate, it was a wonderful thing. But of course it had to be cleared. The snow had to be cleared. Sometimes the water was open after they'd cut chunks. It was a dangerous bit of work, but it employed farmers and teams for the winter when they needed to bridge into the next growing season. Also, a lot of agriculture farms in the area. This is corn. This is a vegetable canning plant, and they're doing husking, corn husking, and you can see that this was an occupation for everyone, including children. And there's no relationship that I know of with G.W. Robinson, but this was his meat wagon that he delivered meat to all the houses in Gardner and South Gardner. I include a lot of these photos because Robinson was famous because he was the first American poet to write poetry about ordinary people. He didn't use language like thee and thy, and he didn't talk about flowery subjects as most late Victorian poets did. And so he was unique. And that tiny book that I showed you a picture of was actually a really big moment in American poetry, because that was a real change. And because of that, his poetry had a lot of trouble in the beginning becoming accepted by publishers. So this is one of the rooms in the Robinson house. And the Robinson family came to Gardner from Head Tide because Edward had made a good deal of money in lumber surveying and other businesses. And he had a good solid fortune, and he wanted to find a bigger community in which to establish himself as a man of wealth and business. In Gardner, he quickly gained seats on bank boards and participated in civic affairs. Edward's aspirations were clearly in line with his new community, and though they were never accepted by Gardner's elite, dominated by the Gardner and Richards families, the Robinsons were well established and respected by their Gardner peers. Again, this is one of the parlors in the Robinson home from the Gardner Library archives. With their comfortable home full of books, the Robinson family included evenings at home with Mary playing the piano, and E.A.'s father, who he described as otherwise a hard-headed businessman in a letter to a friend, loved to recite poetry, especially Shakespeare. But for their son, a life writing poetry was never in their parents' idea of success. Here is E.A.R.'s high school graduation photo. Tall and slim with dark hair, he was considered handsome, but he was never popular. He hated the term shy, yet he always preferred the company of a few close friends and hated crowds. In direct contrast to his middle brother Herman, who was 5 years his senior, E.A.R. did not excel at sports or socially. His years in Gardner schools were unremarkable. Except that in 1881, in the Gardner Public Schools, a female teacher caught Robinson daydreaming in class and delivered a sharp blow to his right ear, which, besides getting his attention, resulted in surgeries and other treatments and permanent, nearly total hearing loss in that ear. For his entire life, he suffered with frequent bouts of intense pain in that ear. And I suspect, as many of you who've had hearing problems, part of his shyness may have been because of his hearing loss. And he didn't like crowds because he couldn't hear conversation very well. At about the same time, Bryant's only child, Minnie, here she is in her Victorian splendor, sitting at the Gideon Palmer fountain in Gardner Common. And in the way background, you can see that brick building. And that was the old Gardner High School, which is no longer standing. It was replaced by another building, which is no longer standing. It's a parking lot now. And as it turns out, there are very few actual photographs of the old Gardner High School around. So I love this photo because you see how small Gardner really is. This is where Minnie also went to high school, and she surpassed her parents' education and became a school teacher. More parallels in their lives. EAR was very close to his eldest brother, Dean, who was 12 years older and had attended Bowdoin College and medical school. Though Dean fulfilled his father's ambitions for him, he was never very happy as a country doctor. He did serve as Gardner City physician. EAR looked up to Dean. Later in his life, as Dean's substance abuse disorder became acute, EAR and Herman pooled their resources to provide Dean with a way to make a living in town by operating a pharmacy at this location downtown. And again, this is part of the tour, the walking tour. This is now Berry and Berry Floral, but it was a pharmacy. It was something for Dean to do. I also suspect that it provided his steady source of the morphine he needed more and more of as his addiction grew more acute. Fortunately for EA, there were citizens of the town who recognized his writing talent and did all in their power to foster and encourage the youth in his early poetry aspirations. A deep ravine and small stream divided the Robinson house from the home of homeopathic physician and aspiring poet, Dr. Alanson Tucker Schumann. Schumann was considered a local eccentric and had a reputation as a womanizer, and is probably the inspiration for one of Robinson's great poetic characters, John Everell Down. Here is Schumann's house today. Schumann invited the teenage Robinson to join the Gardner Poetry Society, which met at the home of retired schoolteacher Caroline Davenport Swan. And this is her house, as shown today in a recent photo, on School Street. The group included probate judge Henry Webster, and their weekly gatherings featured reading and critiquing each other's work. Swan saw potential in the teen poet, and in 1890 published 3 of his poems in the Gardner Reporter Monthly that she put together. Through the connections of the peripheral members of the club, music composer Kate Vanna, Robinson met a gentleman named Thorne, William Henry Thorne. And this is the Vanna house on Lincoln Avenue. It's just down from the Robinson house. In 1894, Thorne, who had a publication called The Globe in New York, published a few of Robinson's poems, the first time he saw a wider audience, and a few of the other members of the Poetry Society. And he was a very colorful character. It would take me longer than I have tonight to tell you about him. But he's widely believed to be the basis of Robinson's Flamande. So if you read that poem, you get a real gist for what William Henry Thorne was all about. All of this was great encouragement to the young poet. Here is a recent photograph of the home once owned by Vanna, as I said. And when his self-published book of poems that I showed you earlier, when those came out in 1896, EAR, young and hopeful, sent copies to all sorts of people, including Gardner's famous writer and leading citizen, Laura E. Richards. Mrs. Richards was so impressed with the little blue book of poems that she invited EAR to tea at the Yellow House. This is the Yellow House today, still owned by a descendant of Laura Richards, also a former bandmate of Ron and I, plays the bass, great guy. And yeah, we actually used to practice up in the barn in the back. I used to wonder what Laura Richards would think of the blues and rock and roll and soul being done in her barn. But he was so shy and so intimidated by Mrs. Richards that he was going to refuse. And Dr. Schumann convinced him that to refuse an invitation by Mrs. Richards to tea would not be the done thing. Eventually, there was established between the two writers a deep bond of friendship. LER became a mentor and mother figure to EAR. She enfolded him into her family life. Now this is a kind of a cute picture. This is Laura E. Richards turning to look at Edwin Arlington Robinson, and he's uncomfortably ensconced in the family group for a photo, and she's leaning in, and who knows what he's just said and what her expression says. But I love that photo. Laura Richards and her architect husband, Henry, who was part of the Gardner family, were just amazing, prominent citizens in Gardner, and so many things in the city are, from the waterworks to the high school, are to their credit, including the Gardner Public Library, which Henry designed, and they raised money to build. They also had a camp out at Cobussy County, and this is out at the family camp. And there they are on the porch having their evening meal. But this is my favorite. This is Robinson in a boat with some of the Richards kids. And not only would the connections with the Richards family and the Gardner family serve him well later in his career, but Richards and Robinson maintained a correspondence that lasted his entire life. LER even penned the first biography of EAR, which she had him approve as she wrote it. And that's where he said he didn't like the word shy. But this photograph, years later, Rosalind Richards, who's in the photo, but I can't remember which one she is, I think she's paddling. And EAR was a little sweet on her. And actually, now records that were sealed for many years show that he asked her to marry him, and she, shocked, refused. Socially, they were no match, and he was a poet that had no other way of making a living, so it would not have been a very good match. But Henry Richards later was writing some recollections about EAR, and this is what he wrote. He was strong and muscular, but he did everything stiffly and awkwardly, and seemed conscious of his awkwardness. And I think this photo shows you how conscious he was of his awkwardness. One of his best Gardner friends was Harry DeForest Smith, who lived in this house on Iron Mine Hill. Now it's the Old Brunswick Road. The two spent many happy hours traipsing through the pine groves and talking about their futures. They carried on a great correspondence that survives today and tells us a great deal of what we know about this period in EAR's life. Harry graduated from Bowdoin and became a teacher. He had quite an impressive career, and EAR missed him terribly when he went off to college and left EAR behind. Robinson visited Harry's parents frequently here at their home after Harry left. While his friends were off to college, though his academic record was not stellar, and he hadn't even taken the college preparatory courses at Gardner High School, his father did not see college in his future, but rather some sort of gainful employment. They didn't know what. EAR did not tell his father that he hoped to make writing his career. His parents, meanwhile, worried about his social awkwardness and enrolled him in dance classes, like you do when you have an awkward child. It was at dancing school that EAR met the beautiful Emma Shepard of Farmingdale. Here is the Shepard family home in Farmingdale as seen today. Educated at the best finishing schools in the area, and 4 years his senior, she was adored by every man she met. This photo of her on the right may give you some indication as to why. In fact, he never stopped loving her. He was infatuated with her from the minute that he met her, and so much of his poetry really reflected the triangle, the love triangle between his brother Herman and himself and Emma. And I showed you the photo earlier of Capitol Island on purpose, because in fact, the family was summering at Capitol Island, and Emma went down that summer ostensibly to see EAR. But Herman, his dashing and popular and ever-charming older brother, arrived on the island and literally whisked Emma off her feet. They were married and had 3 daughters, as you can see in this other photo, Ruth, Marie, and Barbara. These nieces were the apple of their Uncle Wynn's eye for the rest of his life. By a strange twist of fate, EAR's ear injury proved to be his ticket out of Gardner. Dr. Schumann suggested EAR receive special medical treatment in Cambridge for his ear. His brother Herman convinced their father to let EA enroll as a special non-degree student at Harvard while he was there. Herman was his father's favorite, and his championship of EAR's cause sealed the deal. It was the Harvard experience that solidified his belief that writing poetry was his destiny, or his affliction, as he later called it, and the only thing at which he would ever excel. An early poem speaks of his coming to terms with the life he saw before him as compared to the life to which his family aspired. In Dear Friends, he writes, "The shame I win for singing is all mine. The gold I miss for dreaming is all yours." EAR was forced to return to Gardner after a year in Cambridge to help take care of his dying father, Edward. There are references to Edward Robinson being addicted to alcohol, but close friends and family members did whatever they could to expunge any reference to that. Edward slipped in mind and in body in the year leading up to his death in July of 1892. The father and son were never close. When his father died, EAR stayed on to help his mother, who was bereft at the loss of her husband, who, given their 15-year age difference, was often more of a father figure than a husband. At the time of Mary Robinson's death in 1896, the family's finances were near ruin. Herman, who fancied himself a financial wizard, lost most of the family money in risky investments out west on land, and these were made more disastrous by the Panic of 1893. They had that nice word for recession back then, a panic. Herman sank into alcoholism as his life and his marriage fell apart. Dean, who had begun self-treatment for neuralgia of the face, which he incurred while serving as a country doctor on the coast of Maine, had become a sad and hopeless alcoholic and morphine addict, requiring constant supervision and steady doses of morphine. Though Dean had tended their dying mother when no other doctor would come near the plague-ridden house, after Mary's death, he advanced his way behind her, dying of an apparent suicide in 1899. All this time, it was Wynne who kept the family together. Imagine, if you will, the three sons who all apparently idolized Emma. Emma living with her girls, trying to be the mother of them all, as her husband sank deeper into despair and alcoholism. Dean pacing the floor like a wraith in the throes of opiate addiction. This clearly would not end well. As Emma and Herman's marriage deteriorated, she turned to the sympathetic and hopelessly devoted EAR for comfort. Matters between the brothers came to a head, and it was clear that EAR had to leave an untenable situation. EAR left Gardner for New York in 1897. Eventually, Emma and her girls returned to the Shepherd home where they lived together thereafter. The couple separated, and Herman later died of late-stage alcoholism and tuberculosis in 1909 in a Boston sanatorium. EA went to New York City, by then the center of the literary world, to try his fate as a writer. After a decade of poverty and almost total despair, his friends came to his aid. None more so than John Hayes Gardner, one of the influential Gardner family. He became friends with Gardner through Mrs. Richards. Here is Oakland's, the famous estate of the Gardners, as it was seen here in Bryant's photo. And here it is. I don't know if this is going to work or not. But I like this photo because the trees weren't quite as mature and you can see the house. Done in the Tudor style in the 1850s. It's still one of the great, those of you from Gardner, it's one of the great landmarks in Gardner. Hayes Gardner was an English professor at Harvard. He used every connection he had to further the career of one he considered a great genius, and he often supported EAR financially. Through another Richards family connection, in 1905, Robinson came to the attention of the President of the United States. Kermit Roosevelt, the son of Theodore Roosevelt, was a student of Laura Richards' son Henry at Groton School. Kermit was so impressed with Robinson's poetry that he sent a copy of one of the books to his father. The president wrote a glowing review for a national magazine, never hurts to have presidential seal, and secured Robinson a job in the New York Customs House that provided him very little work for enough money to support him. And this lasted throughout the Roosevelt presidency. It's what is known as a sinecure, political job. Roosevelt even persuaded Scribner's publishing house to reissue Robinson's second volume of poetry, which he had also self-published with the help of friends, The Children of the Night. At Hayes Gardner's death, Robinson received a legacy that almost literally kept him from starving. When this sum was exhausted, another friend, Louis Isaacs, convinced 11 other friends to join him in providing Robinson with a living of $1,200 a year to support him while he wrote. Robinson's friends were tremendously important to his life, and he was universally described as not only a genius but also a wonderful human being, who gave as well as he received. In their memoirs and letters, his friends portray a man who was painfully honest, driven to his family's trait of perfectionism, but also deeply compassionate. He was a wonderful human being. EAR became one of the first artists at the McDowell Colony in Peterborough, New Hampshire. Summering there from 1911 on, it was at McDowell that he did most of his writing. He spent winters in New York and also some months of the year with friends in Boston, including artist Lila Cabot Perry, who in 1916 painted the portrait of EAR, which now is at Colby College, that graces the cover of Scott Donaldson's biography. This came out in 2007, and it is excellent. If you haven't read it, it is really thorough, and he had access to a lot of things that those of us doing the research in the 90s didn't have access to. And he had the gravitas as a biographer of such as Hemingway to gain access to all of those papers. It's a wonderful, wonderful read. Robinson's most commercially successful work was written in the 1920s. The 1921 collected poems brought his first Pulitzer Prize for poetry and established his place among the great poets. In 1924, he received his second Pulitzer for The Man Who Died Twice. Though some critics panned his long narrative Camelot trilogy, it was Tristram that brought his greatest popular success and gained him in 1927 his third Pulitzer. And we have a member of the audience who brought her own copy of Tristram that I saw as we were introducing ourselves, and there it is. There aren't too many of those around. That's a wonderful... We'll talk more about that during the question and answer too, but thank you for bringing that. Though he never lived in Gardner again, he often visited Emma and his nieces there, and visited other friends, including Mrs. Richards. His poetry was clearly influenced by his hometown along the Kennebec. Gardner's people, with their noble and tragic qualities and human frailties, are woven into his poetry. His dry Yankee sense of humor, most easily apparent in his letters to friends, also comes across in some of his poetry. Even with literary success finally his, Robinson remained humble and never forgot his friends. He often commented that he had no idea what his friends saw in him, but he frequently expressed his gratitude. Scott Donaldson, in this excellent 2007 biography of Robinson, said that Gardner, Tilbury Town, became for Robinson, and I quote, the antagonist of the gifted or far-reaching individual who, a failure by conventional standards, dedicated himself to the interior life, end quote. Donaldson also observed that Gardner gave Robinson a standard to measure himself against, a barrier to try to surmount. Robinson's poetry still stands among the best in the English language, and he should be remembered if only for those great literary accomplishments. For someone like me who grew up in the very places he once walked, I most relate to his humanity and compassion that come through in his letters and the reminiscences of those fortunate to know him. He was the first American poet to write about ordinary people, and these ordinary people and events are part of my history and yours, our Maine history and American history. No one before him wrote a sonnet about an ordinary butcher in the throes of grief, as in the beautiful and haunting Reuben Bright. No one before him gave voice to those who toiled and built and served and otherwise went unseen. Here, by contrast to Oakland's, is the Bryant's simple family home on the hill overlooking the Kennebec River. It was such people Robinson observed and wrote about, and Bryant's own photos capture the people who, for me, represent the most famous characters and stories in Robinson's poetry. Here's a view taken from the South Gardner Congregational Belfry, looking into town, towards town. You can see the Richards Mill way up there at the top on the right. South Gardner was a working-class enclave of Gardner, and its citizens rarely made the history books or newspaper headlines. But here are the farmers, the boat builders, mill workers, and loggers who quite literally worked in the factories for the owners, like Richard Cory in the Robinson poem made famous by Simon and Garfunkel in the 1960s. This is a gentleman, obviously, with his steers. This is, I'm going to go through these fast because now we've lost some time. This is Hiram Batchelder with a steam engine. This was taken inside the Lawrence lumber mill. Again, the people that Robinson wrote about at the time he was writing, the places that he lived. This is scow building on the Kennebec River, flat-bottom boats that could carry goods in shallow water. And this is Mr. Willie with his cows. I always think of the poem Reuben Bright, the gentleman who I referred to earlier, the butcher in grief for his wife. And one of the most famous of Bryant's poems in his early years was called The Turin. And this is actually a picture of Minnie and her cousin Frankie at the falls, and this is on the Oaklands estate. It's the Rolling Dam Falls at the Oaklands property that divides South Gardner from the city proper. The torrent. I found a torrent falling in a glen where the sun's light shone silvered and leaf split. The boom, the foam, and the mad flash of it all made a magic symphony. But when I thought upon the coming of hard men to cut those patriarchal trees away and turn to gold the silver of that spray, I shuddered. But a gladness now and then did wake me to myself, till I was glad in earnest, and was welcoming the time, for screaming saws to sound above the chime of idle waters, and for me to know the jealous visionings that I had had were steps to the great place where trees and torrents go. While they're messing with that, I'll tell you. When Bryant was alive, when EAR was alive, he seldom did interviews. He never spoke publicly. He never wrote an autobiography. He was the quintessential Mainer. He was tight-lipped, and he often called himself a Maine clam. He let his work speak for him. And once, when he declared that Pulitzers and recognition aside, the true test of his poetry would be if people were still reading it 100 years later. And we are. His poetry does continue to speak to generations with similar struggles as the world around them changes so fast that it either leaves them behind or leaves them cold. So I've included some slides here that to me evoke specific Robinson poems. There's a photo further down, if we get to see it, of a little baby in a bathtub. It's actually in my book, Along the Kennebec. And every time I see it, every time I see that picture of Dawn White, who I knew many years ago, who's now deceased, it makes me think of the poem, The Children of the Night. And I have a little excerpt that I was going to read to you with that picture. Let us, the children of the night, put off the cloak that hides the scar. Let us be children of the light and tell the ages what we are. And I have a photograph of two old men that we'll see. And it's actually Herman Bryant with Henry Webster. And I hadn't realized for many years that it's probably the same Henry Webster that was in the Gardner Poetry Society with Robinson. He had a wonderful poem called Isaac and Archibald. Isaac and Archibald were two old men. I knew them, and I may have laughed at them a little, but I must have honored them, for they were old, and they were good to me. Robinson died of cancer in 1935 in New York City as he was correcting the last proofs of his final book, King Jasper. In the northwest corner of Gardner Common stands a memorial tablet. There's the baby. Let's catch him while we can. There's the baby.
Go ahead and advance to that.
Okay. Isn't that a sweet picture? And that picture actually is part of the Home in Maine exhibit at the Maine State Museum. All of these photographs are now in the public domain, and they are owned by the people of Maine through the Maine State Museum, where my friend Polly and I donated all of them. So this is the late Dawn White, and I just love the Children of the Light. Just look at that little face, right? And this is Herman and Dan Webster. And Dan Webster, as I said, was a member of the Gardner Poetry Society. And this is a memorial tablet that stands in the Gardner Common, also part of our tour, our Gardner Literary History Tour. And it has an inscription written by Laura Richards, actually. His ashes, EAR's ashes, were interred in the Robinson Palmer plot in Oak Grove Cemetery, next to his parents, grandparents, Dean, Herman, and Emma. I have to say that it's very chilling sometimes to walk in the cemetery and see this plot and think of what I know about them and the tragedy in their family and the deep, deep melancholy that was part of his youth and growing up. And when I speak to high school audiences, I always tell them, no matter what their background, no matter that they come from just Gardner, Maine, they can always be something special, because it's not what you were given, it's what you make of it. And kids are always inspired by Robinson. Herman Bryant died in 1937, leaving behind a treasure trove of images that for me bring so much of EAR's poetry to life, certainly the Tilbury Town poems, like the ones I've illustrated with them tonight. Both men captured the Gardner region as it began its slow and steady economic and social decline in the ensuing decades, as refrigeration replaced ice and lumber, paper, shoes, and textile industries folded. The Kennebec was no longer the highway that led from the valley to the sea and the world beyond. It became an open sewer. When I was a youth growing up in this community in the 70s, that decline was at rock bottom. Hopelessness pervaded as our greatest export became our young people. The river was so polluted by industry and domestic runoff that you could almost literally walk across it. The fumes from the chemicals dumped there would make the paint on the buildings near it peel. Robinson's poetry seemed a prophecy of the ruin that greed and unrelenting progress could wreak. Happily, the Kennebec River as it stands today, in this photo I took looking across from Oaklands, has been revived thanks in large part to the Clean Water Act. Now our once resource-dominated economy in Gardner, as it is in much of the state, is being built upon a resurgence of the arts. Imagine. No longer do the business noses turn up at poets and artists. Galleries, performance art, and quality of life, even specialty brewed beer, by artists and creative entrepreneurs are giving life back to my fair city and similar communities across Maine. The river is once again swimmable, the eagles are back, and hardworking citizens are working diligently to return anadromous fish back up the Cobbessy. The sturgeon, herons, and eagles are daily wonders around the river, where traffic is once again steady, but mostly pleasure craft. The Kennebec River Rail Trail that goes along the Kennebec from Augusta to Gardner may one day connect through Richmond and beyond to connect to the East Coast Greenway. I would like to believe that EAR would approve. I hope you have enjoyed this presentation with all of its little bumps along the way, as much as I have enjoyed putting it together for you, and I thank Ed Friedman for inviting me here to speak with you tonight about one of my favorite subjects. Please come enjoy the Tilbury Town Walking Tour of Gardner, which begins at the Gardner Public Library. Stop into the Community Archives room to look at some of these artifacts, and some of, you can see EAR's high school diploma from Gardner High School and a lot of other wonderful things. And do that walking tour. You would really love it. You can do part of the rail trail while you're there. I would be happy to take questions and lead any discussion you might like to have. I know it's getting late. We used up a little time with all of our... Are we doing okay? So this is, I think, a great picture of Robinson, the thoughtful, quiet, but not shy Edwin Arlington Robinson. Do you have any questions? Thoughts? Some of you in this room, I was a little nervous to start out, because some of you in this room have read Robinson, reading him in a class, from Gardner, know how to pronounce anadromous better than I do. And just, you're a little bit of an intimidating crowd, but I would be happy to take your questions. Yes?
I did not hear what you said happened to his ear that caused the deafness.
Okay, well, he was in a class in a public school in 1881, daydreaming, as he was wont to do, and he was tall and skinny, and he sat in the back of the class with his legs hanging out. They used to actually call him Long Robinson, daydreaming like poets do, and the teacher came up to get his attention and cuffed him.
Oh, no shit.
Yeah, right in the right ear. And he already had some kind of a mastoid infection inside the ear, and that exacerbated that, and it was really a lifelong permanent injury. He had several surgeries, special treatments in Cambridge, and always had ear pain. And he used to write to his friends that he worried that that damage would move to his brain. And it was terrible pain. And any of you who have hearing disorder, my mother does, and it's a most isolating situation. And so, can you imagine? But that, like some things are meant, some things have a negative side, some things have a positive side, and that's how he ended up at Harvard. He would never have had that experience. He would maybe not have gotten out of Gardner for a while had he not had medical reason to go. Questions? Anybody want to tell a little bit more about what's going on with the fish passage upstream? You folks are from upstream.
Well, the Gardners, when they showed up in colonial Gardner, the first thing they did was build a dam, because that's what made Gardner special, was the water power.
Right.
There were up to 8 dams on Cobbessy Stream in the first mile of the stream, because it falls 130 feet in a mile. And so the Gardner family maintained ownership of those water seats throughout the 19th century, and sold off little bits of horsepower to various little industries that grew all along the stream. And but from 1761 until now, the fish have not been able to go up. They went all the way up to Reedfield in Maranacook Lake, and they haven't been able to get up. And so we're working to try to get fish passage on the remaining 3 dams that are there. And, yeah, I'm on the municipal committee that administers the New Mills Dam, which is the uppermost one that maintains the water level on Pleasant Pond. And we just had a surveyor out there today doing a topographic survey of the dam property as part of an alternatives analysis, because Upstream's nonprofit group is paying for an engineering study to see what kinds of fish passage would be appropriate for that dam.
Yeah, yeah. You folks are doing amazing work, and my time in the legislature, I was following what you were doing, and there's a long way to go before those little fish can go up the stream.
But I was really excited because, like, my property backs up on the Robinson household.
Oh, yeah, that's right. You said you lived on Fremont. Yep.
Fremont Street, and I had no idea that's where he was, and so I've learned so much about it. And Chuck Kellogg's house was in
Yep.
it.
Yeah, and I'm going to pass these out. These are the walking tour guides. Mom, would you start those around, please? I learn something new every time I read about Robinson. I learn something new every time I read his poetry. And walking around this tour really does bring it alive for you. Really the short circumference of his world that had such an impact on a poet that would still stand today as one of the greatest in American literature. And I have to say, if you have any questions as you're doing the tour, I always forget when I'm looking at the houses in Farmingdale which one belonged to the Shepherds. I always forget. It's the one on the right as you're looking up Sheldon Street. But if you're lost anywhere in it, or if you're not sure which house it is, you can go on your any mobile device and find the Edwin Arlington Robinson website, and you can click through it, and it will give you some pictures that will help orient you. Yes, sir.
I was wondering if you had a favorite poem by Robinson, and maybe you read it to us, or part of it, or.
Yeah. Thank you. I would like to read one of my favorites. I'll read. I got distracted from with all the technical stuff, and I wanted to read. There are two poems. First of all, everybody loves Richard Cory. You all know Richard Cory? I won't bore you with that one. Let's do. I've never bored, but here we go. This one is called Aunt Imogen. And there are only two poems that scholars believe actually reflect autobiographical subjects, apart from the love triangle that's embedded in a lot of his poems, and the miserable, unhappy marriage of his brother Herman and Emma in Eros Tyrannos. But this is Aunt Imogen. And this is EAR himself cloaked in a woman's garb. Aunt Imogen. Aunt Imogen was coming, and therefore the children, Jane, Sylvester, and young George, were eyes and ears, for there was only one Aunt Imogen to them in the whole world, and she was in it only for 4 weeks in '52. But those great bites of time made all September a Queen's festival, and they would strive informally to make the most of them. The mother understood and wisely stepped away. Aunt Imogen was there for only 1 month in the year, while she, the mother, was always there. And that was what made all the difference. She knew it must be so, for Jane had once expounded it to her so learnedly that she had looked away from the child's eyes and thought, and she had thought of many things. There was a demonstration every time Aunt Imogen appeared, and there was more than one this time, and she was at a loss just how to name the meaning of it all. It puzzled her to think that she could be so much to any crazy thing alive, even to her sister's little savages, who knew no better than to be themselves. But in the midst of her glad wonderment, she found herself besieged and overcome by 2 tight arms and 1 tumultuous head, and therewith half bewildered and half pained by the joy she felt and by the sudden love that proved itself in childhood's honest noise. And the poem does go on, but isn't that sweet imagery? So you know this man adored those children. And at one point when he was in New York and the poetry wasn't selling, and Emma was struggling, and she was taking in sewing, and the girls needed shoes and so forth, and He tried his hand at fiction and some stage plays to try to make what they thought then was easy money, writing Broadway plays. It never came to anything. But he, ever after, worked very hard to spend time with them, and how awkward that must have been. The story goes that after Herman died, EAR came back to Gardner, to Farmingdale, and stayed at the Shepherd House with Emma and the girls, and that he tried to convince Emma to finally marry him. And the family didn't really talk about it till quite recently. Those things were revealed. And there is some suggestion that Emma had made a promise to Herman before he died that he would not marry Wynne after he died. And there also is, I think the more rational explanation is that both of them knew that his life of poetry was not a life in which a family was going to fit. He was totally devoted to his poetry. And even though he became ultimately successful, that was never assured, and it was quite a tenuous proposition. So I think they decided to remain close friends, and he, the faithful Uncle Wynne. The other one I love, and I'll do this because I was going to read this earlier, Miniver Cheevy. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah. I have lots of them marked, so you know how it is, my poor broken book. Now this Miniver Cheevy is the other autobiographical poem. This one has a slightly darker tone, if you haven't heard it. Miniver Cheevy, child of scorn, grew lean while he assailed the seasons. He wept that he was ever born, and he had reasons. Miniver loved the days of old when swords were bright and steeds were prancing. The vision of a warrior bold would set him dancing. Miniver sighed for what was not, and dreamed and rested from his labors. He dreamed of Thebes and Camelot and Priam's neighbors. Miniver mourned the ripe renown that made so many a name so fragrant. He mourned romance, now on the town, and art, a vagrant. Miniver loved the Medici, albeit he had never seen one. He would have sinned incessantly could he have ever been one. Miniver cursed the commonplace and eyed a khaki suit with loathing. He missed the medieval grace of iron clothing. Miniver scolded the gorn he sought, but sore annoyed was he without it. Miniver thought and thought and thought and thought about it. Miniver Cheevy, born too late, scratched his head and kept on thinking. Miniver coughed and called it fate and kept on drinking. Robinson also had a struggle with alcoholism, and whether or not he was fully an alcoholic, he recognized that he had the family trait, and he had seen it destroy the men in his family, and he pretty much gave up drinking. And he didn't abide with prohibition, but he definitely realized the damage that it could cause and what it was doing to him, so he stopped. Thank you for asking that, because I would have missed Aunt Imogen and Miniver Cheevy with all of that was going on there.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes?
You said that he died in New York, and it doesn't sound like he ever had much money. I wondered how the funeral was paid for. Do you know how the services were conducted?
I don't, and what I remember is that they were very simple. He wasn't a very flamboyant person. He didn't like crowds. And in fact, he had dozens and dozens of friends, but none of them actually, they were all compartmentalized. They didn't know one another. And so when they did have a memorial, whatever they had, some of them met each other for the first time. But he was cremated and his ashes interred in Oak Grove with the family. And there was the tablet in Gardner, but I don't know what else went on for a service. Good question. I'll have to look that one up. He wasn't a religious person. He called himself a transcendentalist, but he did believe in an afterlife. He believed that his poetry was his service to humankind, and he believed that he had to be true to that because that's all that he knew that he had to do. And so he didn't like organized religion. I doubt that there was a church service, but I don't know. I'll look that up. Good. Thank you so much for your attention. Thanks for